Before dawn, a string of strobe lights blinks across a mile of black water. Each light is a person, floating, waiting to see whether help reaches them before the cold does. This is the Bering Sea off the Aleutian Islands, a 1,000-mile chain of near-empty American volcanoes most people can't name. The easy answer is that this place kills with cold and storms. That answer is incomplete. The real trap is where these islands sit, what people keep coming here to take, and the machines they trust to beat the odds. Fur hunters learned it. An army learned it. Fishermen are still learning it. Pull back from those lights and look at the map, and the Aleutians barely register. A dotted line of specks trailing off the shoulder of Alaska toward Russia, so far west that the chain crosses the line into the eastern hemisphere. That line is more than 1,000 miles long, and almost nobody lives on it. A few hundred people here, a few dozen there. Most of the islands hold no permanent human being at all. That emptiness is the first clue, and it is a lie. The land is empty. The water around it is one of the busiest, richest, and deadliest workplaces in the United States. Start with the geography, because it sets the whole thing in motion. The Aleutians are the northern rim of the Ring of Fire, dozens of volcanoes shoved up out of deep ocean, rising almost straight to sharp ridge lines with hardly any gentle ground between the summit and the surf. The chain works like a wall. On the south side lies the open North Pacific. On the north side lies the Bering Sea, colder and, more important than it sounds, shallow. A broad, shallow shelf runs north from the islands for hundreds of miles. Remember that shelf. It comes back, and it is one of the reasons the waves up here hit harder than their height should allow. When a big swell rolls off the deep Pacific and up onto shallow water, it can't stretch out anymore, so it stands up. It gets shorter, steeper, and meaner. A wave that would have lifted you and passed under you in deep water becomes a wall that breaks on top of you instead. Between the islands, the wall has gaps. Those passes are the only way through for water and for ships, and the entire Pacific and Bering trade their tides through them twice a day. That is a staggering volume of water forced through narrow gates, which means current, hard, fast current, running against the wind often enough to pile the sea into short, vertical faces. Unimak Pass, near the eastern end, is a Main Street shipping lane between North America and Asia. Thousands of vessels thread it every year. It is not a forgiving street. Get the timing wrong, and the current and the wind stack up against each other until the spacing between the waves collapses and each one arrives before your bow has finished falling off the last. Now put a single person inside all of that. One deck, one crew, tied up at Dutch Harbor, the chain's one real working port, on the island of Unalaska. From that dock, most of the fishing grounds lie hundreds of miles out. And if something goes wrong out there, the nearest big Coast Guard airbase is back at Kodiak, hundreds of miles to the east. In winter, the Coast Guard pushes helicopters forward to tiny outposts at Cold Bay and on St. Paul Island, closer to the grounds. But closer out here still means a long flight over open black water in the dark, at the edge of a helicopter's fuel. Distance is not a footnote in this story. Distance is a weapon, and the geography loads it. So does the weather. And the weather here is not ordinary bad weather. The Aleutians sit directly under the track where North Pacific storms are born, and where they deepen fastest. Low-pressure systems spin up over the boundary between that warmer Pacific air and the cold of the north, and they detonate. Winds past hurricane strength, seas that build across 1,000 miles of open water and then slam into the chain with nothing to slow them. The old handbooks called it a graveyard of storms. The Aleut called it the Smoky Sea, for the fog that sits on the water for weeks at a time, thick enough that a person on deck can lose sight of their own hands. Fog is not just discomfort out here. Fog removes the coastline. It takes away the horizon and every visual reference a human being uses to judge which way is up and how close the rocks are, and it hands the entire job of not dying over to instruments, a compass, a radar screen, a depth reading, with no way left to check them against your own eyes. On the water, that means you can be a mile from a cliff you cannot see, closing at 10 knots, trusting a gauge. In the air, it was worse. During the war, air crews flying these islands lost planes not to the enemy, but to weather that swallowed the ground whole. And the accident reports from that campaign are thick with men who simply flew into a mountain the fog had erased. And then there is the wind that comes off the islands themselves. Cold, heavy air pools over the high snowfields. Gravity drags it downhill. It funnels into the valleys and saddles between the peaks, and as it squeezes through those gaps, it accelerates, until it spills off the slopes and hits the water as a single violent blast. Sailors call it a willy-waw. These gusts have been clocked near 140 miles an hour, a Category 4 hurricane arriving in one punch, out of nowhere, off the land. A willy-waw can tear a boat off its anchor and drag it across a harbor. It can knock a small vessel flat. It can throw an aircraft down in the seconds when it is slowest, on takeoff or landing. There is a cruel wrinkle to it too. A willy-waw can blast the fog clear in a few minutes, hand you a sudden bright window, and then let the fog creep straight back over you before you have finished deciding what to do with it. That is the machine in its simplest form. Geography builds the wall and the gates, weather loads them. The sea delivers the force fast, in a place where help is always far away. And people understood this long before there were engines to fight it. The Unangaks, the people Russian traders later renamed Aleut, had lived along this chain for thousands of years. Before contact, somewhere between 15 and 18,000 of them were spread across the islands in hundreds of small villages, tucked into sheltered coves. They hunted the same violent water that kills professional crews today. And they did it in skin boats. The Ikyaks, the Baidarka, was a frame of driftwood and bone lashed together and stretched with sea lion hide, light enough to carry over one shoulder, fast enough to run down a sea otter. They wore hooded parkas sewn from strips of seal gut, stitched so finely the seams shed water. In a boat you could put a fist through in water that kills an unprotected man in minutes, they built one of the great maritime cultures on Earth. The trick was never the boat. The trick was knowing the water, reading the sky, the shape of the swell, the set of the current in the passes, and above all, knowing when not to go out at all. A hunter who launched into the wrong window did not get a rescue helicopter. He got nothing. So the whole culture was built around patience. You went when the sea allowed it, and you stayed home when it didn't. And staying home was not cowardice, it was competence. Survival here was never about forcing the sea. It was about matching it, waiting it out. Working inside the windows the weather permitted, and refusing the ones it didn't. That restraint was a technology of its own, and for most of human history, it was the single most advanced piece of equipment anyone ever brought to these islands. Everything that came later, the engines, the steel, the beacons, was in some sense an attempt to buy back the one thing the Unangaks already had, a way to survive a bad decision about when to be on the water. Then, in 1741, Vitus Bering's expedition reached the chain, and the reason people came changed completely. The Russians were not here to live alongside the sea otter. They were here to strip it. Otter pelts were worth a fortune in the China trade, and the Unangaks, in their Baidarkas, were the only hunters on Earth who could take those animals at scale. So the Promyshleniki, the Russian fur hunters, did not simply trade. They coerced. They took women and children hostage, forced the men into hunting fleets, and drove them out onto the water to fill quotas set by people who had never had to read that sky. Here is the part that matters. The Unangaks had spent millennia surviving this place by choosing their moments. The fur trade took the choosing away. When your family is being held ashore, and your job is to come back with pelts, you launch in weather you would never have launched in on your own terms. You stop asking whether the sea will allow it. You go because you have been told to go. The result was a collapse. Between the diseases the Russians carried and the sheer grind of forced hunting and killing conditions, the Unangaks' population fell by something on the order of 80 to 90% within a few decades. From a people 15,000 strong, perhaps 12 or 1,500 were left by the early 1800s. The exact figures are argued over. The scale is not. And look at what actually did the killing. Not the cold on its own, not the fog. The cold and the fog had been constants for thousands of years, and the Unangaks had answered them with patience. What broke was the patience, traded away for someone else's schedule, someone else's quota, someone else's idea of an acceptable risk. The first people to die in numbers on this water died because ambition overrode judgment about when to be on it. Keep that in mind, because the tools were about to get much better. Engines came, then steel hulls, printed charts, radios, weather forecasts, survival suits, aircraft, and distress beacons. Every one of them was a real answer to a real problem the Unangaks had met with nothing but skill and restraint. On paper, each advance made the water safer. What they actually did was let people push farther out later in the season, into worse conditions than any hunter in a skin boat would ever have dared, and carry them clean past the reach of anyone who could come and get them. For most of history, the reason to be out here was fur. When the otters were gone, the reason became the route itself. The Aleutians sit astride the shortest track between North America and Asia. And by the 20th century, that geographic accident turned the chain into something armies wanted. Whoever held these islands could reach across the top of the Pacific. That made a fog-bound, storm-hammered nowhere suddenly worth fighting for, and in 1942, it was fought for. In June of that year, Japanese forces seized 2 islands at the far western end of the chain, Kiska and Attu. It was the only North American soil a foreign enemy seized during the war, and back home it landed hard. After the Aleutians were attacked, more Americans could find those islands on a map than could find Hawaii. For nearly a year, the response was mostly bombing runs flown from bases farther east, in weather that killed almost as many airmen as the enemy did, because a Williwaw does not care whose plane it is. Then, in May 1943, the United States decided to take Attu back by force. The operation was called Land Crab, and it is one of the clearest cases on record of this system doing exactly what it does. Start with the objective. Roughly 15,000 American troops put ashore to retake a barren volcanic island held by a dug-in Japanese garrison. The planners looked at the map and the enemy numbers and predicted the whole thing would take about 3 days. Now the first warning, one they handed themselves, and then ignored. The 7th Infantry Division had trained for desert combat in California. When the transports loaded out, no serious cold weather gear went aboard with the first waves, partly to disguise where they were headed. So men waded ashore onto an Aleutian island in leather boots and light field clothing, into a place the Aleut had long called the Cradle of Storms. Attu did not need the Japanese to start taking Americans out of the fight. It snows on that island much of the year. What is not snow is bog and freezing rain, and that same fog, sitting on the ground so thick that supply planes could not find the units they were meant to drop to, and men went days without food. The leather boots soaked through and stayed soaked, because there was no dry ground anywhere and no way to get warm. Feet froze. Trench foot set in. the crippling breakdown of flesh that comes from days on end in cold, wet, filthy boots, and then frostbite, and then, for hundreds of them, gangrene. Men were carried off the line who had never once been shot at. The pressure was the schedule and the terrain working together. 3 days of fighting became 19. Wheeled vehicles sank to the axles in the muck, so supplies moved up by hand, in human chains more than a mile long, across ground that swallowed everything set on it. The Williwaws came off the peaks and threw aircraft down out of the sky. And when it was finally over, the arithmetic told the real story. 549 Americans had been killed by the enemy and more than 1,100 wounded, but over 2,000 more had been evacuated for exposure, frostbite, and disease. The cold injuries alone outnumbered the combat wounds. On Attu, the island hurt more men than the enemy did, so here is what Attu adds to the fur trade lesson, and it is colder. You can bring the full weight of a modern military, men, ships, aircraft, a plan drawn up by professionals, and this place will still find the seam you left open. The army left the seam of the weather. They planned against the enemy and forgot the island, and the island collected. Afterward, the medical corps studied Attu's frozen feet and rewrote how America clothed its soldiers for the cold. And those lessons carried into the rest of the Pacific War. The system took its casualties and then, as it always does, moved on. The Coast Guard kept a station on Attu for decades. They shut it down and walked away in 2010. The island is empty again. After the war, the reason to come here changed one more time. And this is the reason that still pulls people onto that water today: fish. The Bering Sea shelf, that same shallow shelf on the north side of the chain, is one of the most productive stretches of ocean on the planet. Pollock, cod, and crab in numbers that built an entire industry. Dutch Harbor became, by the weight of what crosses its docks, one of the busiest fishing ports in the country. And here is the knot at the center of everything. The same geography that makes this water lethal is what makes it rich. The cold, nutrient-heavy water that breeds the storms is the water that breeds the fish. You cannot go get the one without standing in the other, which sharpens the trap. Fishing here is not leisurely work. It runs on seasons, quotas, and shore plant schedules, a race against a closing window and against every other boat trying to fill its hold before the same window shuts. The crab is worth the most when the season is open. And the season is open in winter, when the Bering Sea is at its absolute worst. So the pressure that once came from a Russian fur boss now comes from a calendar and a paycheck, and it pushes crews to do the one thing the Unangaks built their entire survival around never doing: go out when the sea is telling you to stay in. February 14th, 1983. 2 crab boats leave Dutch Harbor within hours of each other, bound for the grounds near the Pribilof Islands, up on that shallow shelf. The Americus and the Altair, sister ships, modern, well-built, the kind of vessels their crews thought of as close to unsinkable. Both are loaded with crab pots stacked high on deck. 14 men aboard between them, most of them young, several under 25. Another boat passes the Altair in the dark, not long after she clears the harbor, close enough to see her running steadily on course. That is the last time anyone sees her. Then, nothing. That afternoon, a passing freighter spots a capsized hull about 25 miles out of Dutch Harbor. It is the Americus, floating upside down, no obvious damage to her, no crew in sight. The Altair is simply gone. She was never found. No mayday came from either boat. No one in a survival suit was ever pulled alive from the water. 14 men vanished in the time it takes a hull to roll over. The investigation ran for 2 years, and what it found is the quiet horror at the center of this whole industry. The boats had not been smashed by some monster wave. They had been loaded in a way that left them without enough stability, too much weight carried too high, after years of added gear and equipment had slowly changed how the vessels sat in the water without anyone recalculating what that did to them. Every boat floats because the shape of its hull keeps trying to push it upright faster than the sea can shove it over. Load weight high enough and you shrink that margin until it is gone. Push a boat in that condition hard in a beam sea and it does not fight its way back up. It goes over and it keeps going. And this is why there was no distress call, which is a pattern you will see again. A stability capsize is not a slow flooding you can radio about while you fight it with pumps. The boat lies down and rolls in seconds, faster than a man can reach the radio, faster than he can pull on a survival suit, often faster than the crew resting below even understands what is happening to them. The Americas floated upside down for 2 days, a piece of evidence with no witnesses. Whatever those men did in the final seconds, the sea gave them no time to do it, and left no record that they tried. The Americas and the Altair were not even the whole of it. Across that same stretch of weeks in early 1983, 4 crab boats went down in the Bering Sea, and by the time the season's toll was counted, the disaster had put a national spotlight on what safety advocates were calling the most dangerous, unregulated occupation in the country. Sit on that phrase. Not one of the most dangerous jobs, the most dangerous and unregulated, meaning nobody was required to check whether a boat leaving the dock was loaded in a way that would keep it upright. The 2-year federal investigation that followed became a turning point, the start of a long, grinding push to force stability standards and survival gear onto a fleet that had run for decades on the honor system and the nerve of its skippers. So the reversal here runs deeper than the one before it. Attu proved the place could outkill the enemy. The Americas and the Altair proved that the boat itself can become the thing that kills you. These were not reckless kids in a leaky skiff. They were a professional crew on 2 of the most capable vessels in the fleet, killed by a few tons of weight in the wrong place, physics they could not see, and had never been properly warned about. The technology built to make them safe carried a hidden flaw that only showed itself at the exact moment recovery was already impossible. And notice what all that engineering had still not changed. Communication was improving fast in these years, better radios, and soon distress beacons that could bounce a call off a satellite. None of it shortened the distance. None of it put a single rescuer any closer to the grounds. You could now, in theory, tell the entire world you were dying. You still had to stay alive on your own until the world could cross hundreds of miles of the worst sea in America to reach you, assuming you got the seconds you needed to make the call at all. Now line those 2 failures up, because the next boat combined them and added distance on top. Make the vessel bigger, make it steel and old. Send it not 25 miles out, but well over 100, toward grounds hundreds of miles farther still, past the last forward outpost, in the dead of a Bering Sea winter, and then take away the one thing that had been getting better. Let the ship send its distress perfectly, instantly, to a satellite, while the nearest help sits in the dark more than 200 miles away and can only begin the long, cold flight out. The ship was the Alaska Ranger, a 189-foot fish processing trawler, built back in the early 1970s for the oil fields and later converted to catch and process fish. On the night of March 22, 2008, she left Dutch Harbor bound for Petrel Bank, a fishing ground roughly 500 miles to the west, out near the far end of the chain. 47 people were aboard. That number matters, so keep it. 47 human beings, on an aging hull, steaming into the dark toward a spot so remote that Dutch Harbor itself, the last real port, would soon be 120 miles behind them. Around 2:30 in the morning on March 23rd, the crew found water where there should not have been any. It was coming into the rudder room, at the stern. This is the concrete first warning, and at first, it did not read as a death sentence. Flooding in one compartment is a problem you fight. They started fighting it. But the water kept coming, faster than it should have, and it did not stay in the rudder room. It pushed forward into the engine room and beyond, because the watertight boundaries that were supposed to seal each compartment off from the next were not holding. Investigators later concluded the trigger was most likely the loss of one of the ship's rudders, a failure at the stern that opened a 9-inch hole straight into the hull through the rudder trunk, with the exact source never fully pinned down because the wreck lies under 6,000 feet of water and was never examined. At 2:46 a.m., the Alaska Ranger broadcast a mayday. And here's the difference the Century made. The signal went out cleanly. It was heard. Word reached the Coast Guard almost at once. On St. Paul Island, at that tiny forward outpost, a rescue helicopter crew was pulled off standby. The cutter Monroe, a 378-foot Coast Guard ship, was on patrol near the ice edge, and her captain ordered the engineers to light off her gas turbines and run. Sister fishing vessels in the same fleet, the Alaska Warrior among them, turned and steamed toward the Rangers' position at their best speed. Everything generations of technology had promised was working. The call got out. The machine of rescue began to move. None of it could change the distance. The helicopter out of St. Paul had better than 200 miles of black, freezing air to cross before it could put a light over the survivors. The Monroe, even sprinting, was hours away. And on the Ranger, the situation was collapsing along a chain of failures that each made the next one worse. When the ship lost electrical power, the hydraulic pumps that controlled the propellers stopped, and the pitch of the propeller blades reversed on its own. The vessel began driving herself astern, backward, into the sea. That did two things, both fatal. It forced the flooding stern deeper under the water, speeding the sinking, and it dragged the ship out from under two of her 3 life rafts. The rafts swung away from the crew who needed them. So picture the point of no return, because on the Alaska Ranger, there is a clean line between mission and survival. For an hour, this was a flooding they were trying to stop and a ship they were trying to save. Then the captain gave the order to abandon ship, and the objective narrowed to one thing: get off and stay alive in the water long enough to be found. Men pulled on their survival suits, the thick neoprene gear crews call Gumby suits, the single most important piece of equipment on a boat like this, and went into a sea a few degrees above freezing. Some jumped and were swept beyond the rafts by the same sternward motion that had already pulled the rafts away. They ended up scattered across the water, alone, in a line more than a mile long, each man a single strobe light in the dark. That is the image this whole thing opened on. Now you know what it was? The rescue that followed is remembered as one of the greatest in Coast Guard history, and it earned that. Helicopter crews flying on night vision goggles found the strobes and went to work hoisting men out of the waves one at a time, ferrying them to the Monroe, coming back for more. The Alaska Warrior pulled 22 people from 2 life rafts and recovered bodies from the water. In the end, of the 47 aboard, 42 were saved. 5 died. 4 were recovered. 1 was never found. But look at how thin the margin was, even with everything working, because this is the whole point of the Ranger. One survivor, a man named Byron Carrillo, was brought up in a rescue basket to eye level with the crewman leaning out of the helicopter to pull him in. His survival suit had flooded with seawater and grown so heavy he could not move himself off the rim of the basket. The rescuer reached for something to cut the suit and drain it. In that instant, Carrillo slipped from his grasp and fell back into the sea. He was one of the 5 who died, close enough to touch a hand that was reaching for him. That is what the Ranger proves that the earlier boats did not. The 1983 vessels showed that a modern boat can kill you before you can call. The Ranger shows the other face of it, and it is almost worse. Even when the call goes out perfectly, Even when the entire modern rescue apparatus performs about as well as it possibly can, the sea and the distance still take their cut. Comms and hulls and helicopters improved survival enormously. 42 people came home who, in an earlier era, would simply have been a boat that never came back. And it still cost 5 lives because a rescuer over that water is not standing on solid ground handing you up. He is hanging in the same wind, over the same freezing sea, at the end of the same long reach. The people who come to save you are exposed to the exact thing that is killing you. Now take everything, the exposure of Atu, the stability trap of 1983, the distance of the Ranger, and watch it assemble into one boat, because the last case is where the full mechanism finally shows itself. February 11, 2017. The Seattle-based crab boat destination, working the winter grounds off St. George Island in the Pribilofs. Her captain, Jeff Hathaway, had 23 years on that boat and 60 years on the Earth, and he understood icing better than almost anyone alive. He had lost friends to boats that went down. Nobody could call this a man who did not know the danger. The pressure was the calendar, and it was specific. After a long cod season, the destination was getting a late start on snow crab and a shore plant on St. Paul planned to shut its crab processing down around February 25th. To make the trip pay, Hathaway had to get his pots in the water and his catch delivered before that door closed. On the radio, he told another skipper he was worried about making his quota in time. So he loaded the deck, roughly 200 crab pots, and pushed out through a hard winter blow with freezing spray warnings posted across the area. Here is where the mechanism completes itself, and it is the same physics that took the Americas, made visible. The air was well below freezing. In those conditions, every burst of spray that comes over the bow does not run off. It freezes where it lands, on the rails, on the rigging, on the stacked pots, on every exposed surface above the deck. Ice builds, and it builds highest, exactly where the boat can least afford the weight. Up top, above the waterline, above the center of gravity. Investigators later estimated the destination could have taken on as much as 340,000 pounds of ice, well over 150 tons. That is not cargo. That is a second invisible load riding high, quietly shrinking the margin that keeps the hull upright. Until a boat that was stable an hour ago is one wave from rolling. Just after 6 in the morning, as she cleared the shelter of St. George Island into open water, that margin ran out. The destination went over. Her own tracking transponder caught the last minutes, the boat turning in a slow, almost complete circle, a death spiral, and then gone. There was no mayday. The same silence as 1983 for the same reason. A capsize like that happens faster than a hand can reach the radio, and most of the crew were almost certainly below, off watch, when the boat rolled and trapped them. What went out instead was the ship's emergency beacon, the E-Perb, firing automatically as the hull turned over. A machine sent the only distress there was, because there was no time for a person to. All 6 men aboard were lost, and their bodies were never found. Stand back from the destination, and the pattern is complete. Hathaway was the opposite of reckless, a veteran who understood ice better than most men will ever have to. It did not save him, because the thing that killed his boat was never a lack of knowledge. It was the same lever that broke the Unangax hunters, that stranded the Attu landing force in summer field gear, that sent the 1983 boats out overloaded, that put the Alaska Ranger 500 miles from anywhere on a rudder about to fail. It was a schedule that could not bend, sitting on top of a sea that would not. Every one of them was doing something that made sense at the moment they decided to do it. The conditions changed underneath the decision, and by the time the danger was undeniable, the options were already gone. That is the system this whole place runs on, and it has never really changed. The geography sets the constraints: a wall of volcanoes, narrow passes with vicious current, a shallow shelf that stands the waves up, one working port, and rescue based hundreds of miles away. The weather activates them: the storm track, the fog that erases the coast, the williwaws off the peaks, the sub-freezing air that turns spray into structural weight. Human motive supplies the exposure: fur, then sea lanes, then the richest fishery in the country, every one of them valuable for the very reasons that make the water deadly. Technology changes what people will attempt: bigger engines and steel hulls and satellite beacons that let crews go farther, later, into worse, and carry them past the edge of help. And distance decides how many of them come home, because in the Bering Sea, the distress call is fast and the rescue is slow, and the gap between the two is measured in lives. People sometimes ask whether a warming climate is quietly making this safer, since there is less winter ice in the Bering Sea than there used to be. Be careful with that. Less ice is not simply a gentler sea. Open water where there was once ice is open water with a longer runway for the wind to build waves, more fetch, bigger seas, in months that used to be locked down. The mechanism is not disappearing, it is shifting, and how it settles is not yet known. So end where the water does. Out on Attu, at the far western tip, the fog closes back over an empty airstrip and a Coast Guard station no one mans anymore. A piece of ground that hurt more soldiers than an enemy army could. 1,000 miles east, in the dark before a winter opener, a crab boat pulls away from the dock at Dutch Harbor with her pots stacked high and a forecast full of freezing spray, and turns west into the same passes the Bidarkas once read so carefully. For the same reason people have always come to these islands, because what is out there is worth the risk, right up until it isn't. The ice is already starting to whiten the forward rail. Nobody on deck is looking at it yet,